It's time for the Federal Reserve to strike. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainsley Insights, brought to you by Ainsley Bullion, Ainsley Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainsley Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been wondering if we're starting to see a breakdown in the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the administration in the US in terms of how they're approaching the economy and rates. How are you going today, Alex?
Well, how are you?
I'm good. Now, this is a topic we've covered before, and you sort of came back to it again today and pulled it all together in, as you always do, a slightly different way of looking at it. Let's start off with that big picture. What are your thoughts on the current state of inflation and how the Federal Reserve is handling it?
Well, the main reason we've come back to this today is because last night the Federal Reserve announced what they're doing, which is slightly less than what everyone was anticipating in March, and a lot less than what everyone was anticipating in sort of January. So January, everyone was talking about 6 rate cuts. March, when inflation started taking off, they were expecting 2 to 3. And last night, Powell now said 1 to 2. So the rope is getting shorter, and it's looking like Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan may be right, that up is the likely scenario here, not down. And his worst case scenario was 8% interest rates. And the switch so far going from 6 to 1, the next switch is up. So it's going to be interesting.
And it's been such a mess, and that's why we keep coming back to it, because we're almost certain at the last decision or last conference that it's going down. That's the next move we make. Then we get this change of heart. Lots of speak in between. It's just very confusing. I would argue they're losing a whole lot of credibility. But you seem to imply in the article that there's a little bit more behind this, and it's this relationship between the Fed and the administration. How do you see that relationship currently? Is that sort of adding to the turbulence that we're getting in the messaging?
So Powell is damned if he does, damned if he doesn't from here. The reason there is out of control inflation in the US, and a lot of people are saying it's still underreported, is because of fiscal spending. It is just out of control. So interestingly, Powell is basically a student of Volcker, who was the federal chairman under Reagan. Similar scenario, 1970s, insane inflation. Reagan comes in, and he just stopped spending. So he went for fiscal, he pulled it all back in with the help of Volcker. They got it back in place. So the Fed worked with the government because it was fiscal, again, that was creating a lot of the inflation back then. Powell, in no uncertain terms, keeps saying, and he said in the 60-minute interviews, in the long run, the US is on an unsustainable fiscal path. The US federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal debt, and that just means the debt is growing faster than the economy. That's it. He keeps telling them what's going on, and nobody is listening to him. It is an election year. Nobody wants to go into a recession in an election year. So Biden is spending. He's just announced more student debt repayments. Yeah. And then you've got these outside things going on, like the Ukraine war, the Israel conflict. So oil prices are starting to spike. So these are going on, and these are shocks that potentially need more spending with the shock, and there is nothing left. So, yeah.
So I was just going to say on that point, because you bring up, and you've talked about this before as well, but I think it really does need reiteration and more explanation. This idea of supply shocks that we've experienced being different to demand pull factors, and you talk about both of them in your description today. Can you maybe step us through that again? Because when you're talking about oil, for example, that's one that's really relevant in this inflation picture. I think people get really confused around that, about what's actually driving the inflation.
Yeah, so this is why Powell now has to sit on his hands. He might as well shut up, just let everything run, because there is nothing he can do. So you've got we spoke about before at some point that there were 2 types of inflation in Australia that happened that we really hadn't seen in the US because of their energy autonomy. So we hadn't seen it before in the US. Now we're starting to see it. So demand pull is basically when the economy is doing so well, there's lots of fiscal expenditure, and the demand raises inflation because more people have more money to pay for the same goods, so they pay more. So that is demand pull, that is fiscal inflation. The way to deal with fiscal inflation, and Powell keeps warning about this, is to raise interest rates. So that does assist with that type of inflation. Supply shock inflation, on the other hand, is inflation that's driven from wars or oil shocks, or shocks that are inflationary because of something going on in the world, but eventually they'll taper off, or something will fix, or they'll become permanent. But monetary policy or raising interest rates actually exacerbates inflation under those circumstances, because say oil prices are going up, raising interest rates does not help you with that. They're just going to keep going up. What that actually does is mean that houses become more expensive, and financial services like insurance becomes more expensive. So it drives up inflation in certain parts of the economy that actually exacerbates it. So the US right now has both types of inflation. So Powell can do nothing.
Really great explanation. And we've seen a few examples of that play out. I really like the idea when you talk about oil, because that's sort of the perfect one, that you go, well, if the idea of raising rates is to make everyone tighten their belts and not spend as much, that when you're talking about something like oil going up, that's not going to impact your decision, because ultimately that's not very elastic. You need to be able to drive your car to work, for example. You can't just stop working because the oil price goes up. So,
but also, it's not going to, the monetary policy doesn't make the oil cheaper.
No, that's right. So you're saying Powell has no control over it. He clearly doesn't have control over that. I know another example that they were talking with this conflict that's sort of happening around Israel at the moment, that some of those shipping channels can be shut off. Like that's a play we know they've used before and potentially could use again. And that's not something you can control by changing interest rates. Like that's a very, very different thing. That's your supply shock you're talking about. So these things can't be resolved by Powell at all. And you're saying if you've got both going on, he has to sit on his hands. It seems like that's his only option here.
It really does. And you know, if they choose to do what Australia did, which you and I again spoke about before, which was probably incorrect, which was raising rates into the supply shock, it has made mortgages and housing inflation in Australia out of control. So that's what we did in Australia. Now, if there is a misread from the Federal Reserve, which so far I don't think there is, but if there is, and they raise rates into this supply shock, then they're going to end up like Australia, with the interest rate environment probably too high, and more pain and more inflation.
And that's really interesting as well, because I have seen some commentary. The US have been a little bit smug. When I say the US, I mean people from the US who've locked their rates in, because they have that long rate environment where they can lock their rates in for a long time. Fixed rates, I'm trying to say.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
Well, wouldn't it be lovely? And a lot of them were sort of rubbing that in the faces of us Australians, saying, oh, I locked mine in for 30 years at 2% or whatever those low rates were. But you're starting to see some rhetoric now coming out, because a bit of time has passed and people want to sell their house and move on, and going, oh, the rates here, there's 7.5% we're paying on a 30-year mortgage, and that upset coming. Now, they're not so smug now. You know, it's really changed that narrative for them, because
five kids in a 2-bedroom apartment and a 2% mortgage.
Exactly. Stuff that we've been very familiar with here in Australia, because we haven't had that. Now they're starting to experience. So you can see the political pressure will progressively mount in that regard, because as it did here, it becomes a major issue. And I think that probably leads me to my last question. You mentioned about the elections and the potential changes in government policies that could come, particularly on the back of Trump. You know, looking at polling at the moment, it looks like he's likely to at least make a big dent in where we end up in November. Do you see that actually changing what happens with the Federal Reserve here? Does the government approach change under a new leadership? If so, how does that impact their relationship?
Well, I guess so. Probably not, but Trump did and does follow Reaganomics. So there were certain things that he did which was spoken about during Trump's time, which followed Reagan, who was the president that was with Volcker at the time that helped get inflation back under control. So there is the possibility that he does do that, but so far the policies are more about tax cuts. Possibly depreciating the US dollar to make it more competitive, and tariffs again to help promote US manufacturing. All of those are just fiscal or fiscally inflationary in a different mask. So there is a potential that the next president is handed a basket case of an economy, because all that is this can kicking down the road is going to go through to November. We all know it. The likelihood, I mean, we're April now, next potential rate cut is June, then 6 weeks later. So June, I think, only had a 5% chance now of happening. Probably not going to happen. Then you've got June, August, around September. That's going to be too close to the election. The chances of now an interest rate cut are next to nothing, because the Federal Reserve doesn't want to interfere with an election, just like in Australia. So they all sit on their hands for a couple of months. It's just not going to happen. So this can is going to be kicked. Deficits are going to keep going up, $1 trillion every 100 days at the moment. To put it in perspective, they've just had tax day, I think, on the 15th of April, so 2 days ago in the US. So we'll find out soon what their tax receipts were like. But they're receiving $5 trillion in tax receipts and revenue a year. Well, 4 trillion is mandatory. So that's healthcare and social services. About 25% above that is current discretionary spending, which is like these student loans and things like that. But we're now at $1 trillion just in interest. So interest plus discretionaries are now at the total receipts from the government. They're saying 1.6 trillion next year. So we're already at a $600 trillion deficit year on year from now on, with no discretionary spending. That is what the next president is handed.
So it's a really good thing that we're in a really stable geopolitical environment right now, and that there's no potential threats on the horizon, because, when you're already out of balance by that much before there's any potential issue, that's a good thing that everything's nice and stable, isn't it?
That's right. Break even with potentially 2 or 3 wars breaking out around the world. It's awesome.
Just crazy stuff. Well, thank you for all that analysis today, Alex, and that deep dive into those issues. I think we keep paying attention. The picture doesn't look any rosier. It just looks like we're heading into chaos towards the end of the year, but we'll keep analyzing and paying attention regardless. So thanks for your work on that.
Thank you again.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.